Well, before we get there, Stephen, of course, we got a championship game to break down. So, what's your thoughts here? We're less than a week away from the national championship game, Georgia, TCU, out in Los Angeles in the new SoFi Stadium. What's your read on this game?
I think the first thing that jumps to mind is the sort of unprecedented run by both. We were talking about this with TCU, but also Stetson Bennett for Georgia is 60 minutes away from leading Georgia to history. Just to be able to go back to back, the first team since Alabama did in 2011 and 2012 to go back to back. It's one of the most unlikely stories that I can remember for a starting quarterback, not only to win one national championship, but to go two. After you watched him in 2020, I don't think many people would have predicted that Stetson Bennett could lead Georgia to back-to-back national championships. So I think you have Georgia pursuing history. You have TCU, the unlikely run to the national championship game. TCU has nothing to lose here. They're the underdog. They're 2 touchdown underdog or so. All the pressure in the world is on Georgia. I think if you're Georgia, I think there are a couple things that I saw on Saturday that I would be looking for. I think the first thing is don't underestimate TCU. I think Michigan kind of overlooked them a little bit. I think you kind of picked up on that in some of the media availability during the week that Michigan really wasn't overly impressed with TCU. Probably should have spent a little bit more time worrying about TCU. I also think, limiting the mistakes. Like, it sounds simple, but look at Michigan's mistakes on Saturday. They gave a kind of questionable play on the goal line by calling the Michigan special. They fumbled on the goal line. They threw 2 pick-sixes. And I don't think if you're Georgia, I think TCU is the underdog for a reason in this game. You don't want to give them a reason to hang around. If you can limit those mistakes and you play a clean game, you're probably going to win. I think the other matchup for me that I'm watching is the line of scrimmage. TCU fared a lot better than most people think in that game, going into that game. I think the prevailing thought was Michigan offensive line won the Joe Moore Award. They've been running the ball well all season. TCU gives up about 150 rushing yards a game. There's no way they can slow down Michigan. They pretty much did. Michigan's first rushing play went for a long way, but they did a much better job after that. I think the X factor for me in all this is I think Georgia can run between the tackles and or between the guards and the interior a little bit better than Michigan did. And I think for really the biggest reason is Michigan's running back, Donovan Edwards, is more of a speed guy. I think Georgia can come after TCU with some bruisers and McIntosh and Edwards and Milton. All of those guys, we saw this on Saturday in the Peach Bowl of how well they were running, and especially running over some Ohio State defenders in the process. So I think for Georgia, it's to me, it's play a clean game, limit the mistakes, win the battle in the trenches. And also I think Stetson Bennett has to be a little bit cleaner overall. I think he threw an interception, thought he made some, a few other questionable throws in there as well. One other point that I would make on TCU, I think they have won different ways this year. And I think it's hard to, pinpoint like they have to have everything go right, I think, on Monday night to win this game. They can win with their defense. We've seen that. They can win with the running game. Their top running back is questionable. But I think it really all boils down to one thing for them, and that's Max Duggan and the receivers. If Georgia is giving up passing yards like they did to Ohio State, this could be a 4-quarter game. If they keep it in check, I think Georgia controls the game throughout. So I think don't take TCU too lightly. They can win different ways, and don't make the same mistakes as Michigan. And if you're Georgia, you probably walk out of there with the championship.
Right. And that's right where I was going to go, Stephen, is asking you because, TCU, they did score on 2 pick-sixes. Anytime you get 2 pick-sixes in a game, you got no business losing it. And they I don't want to say nearly did, but there was opportunity for Michigan to come out with a victory. But you could slice it the other way, Stephen, and say they got this Heisman finalist quarterback, and he threw a couple interceptions. And I thought he was a little off. Maybe to your point, if he's plays a much better game, he's going to have to be competitive against Georgia. But given that we've seen 2 opponents in a row now, LSU and Ohio State, attack Georgia through the air, I realize Georgia, or excuse me, Ohio State's got one of the best quarterbacks and some of the best receivers. LSU also has a great quarterbacks and great receivers. But does TCU have the weapons? Do you think, given the last 2 weeks or two opponents that Georgia has faced and been hit over the top, that TCU can have some success doing that?
I do. I think they can. I think for Georgia, you almost have to pick something. Like your pass rush is either got to get there, or you just have to create some disruption, or you just have to cover a lot better in the secondary than they did last week. I do think if you were to rate the receiving core, I think Ohio State's is better. I think the challenge that TCU presents is Quentin Johnston, their top receiver, is outstanding. And he took a pass that was, a short screen pass against Michigan and sort of broke a tackle and was gone down the sidelines. It gets to your point of, Michigan made a lot of mistakes in that game. TCU made a lot of mistakes. But when they needed to answer, TCU did that. Like Michigan, every time I felt Michigan was ready to get back in that game, TCU just punched back. And so I think tackling in space, as small as this sounds, like I think if you're Georgia, you're okay if TCU has a 12 play, 75-yard drive that ends in a field goal. You'll take that. You don't want them to get the 10-yard passes that become 70-yard sprints by Quentin Johnston and some of those other receivers. The first thing that jumps out to you when you see all their receivers, like they're giants, like they're 6'4", 6'5". They're guys that can run. They have big time size. So I think there are some matchup problems for Georgia potentially. One thing you brought up, I think, has kind of gone unnoticed is Max Duggan for TCU. I didn't think he had a good game on Saturday. I thought he was off on a lot of throws. Yeah, I think he ended up about 14 of 29. One play for Quentin Johnston went 70-something yards. And I mean, most of that was for him just completing the short pass, and the receiver did most of the work. So I think if you're Georgia, like you're looking at this going, Duggan can hurt you with his legs. He can also hurt you with the big plays. So I think finding some ways to kind of keep him in the pocket and not allow those TCU receivers to catch and run would be a good thing. But I think based upon what Ohio State and LSU did, I think if you're TCU, I think you have to be feeling pretty optimistic about your chances of at least making some plays through the air.
Now, I don't watch enough TCU to maybe you would have a better understanding than I would, Stephen, but Mississippi State runs a similar defense, 3-3-5 under Zach Arnett. Georgia played Mississippi State on the road. And I'm trying to think back to that game. I mean, I feel like Mississippi State held them in check for the most part. At the end of the day, of course, Georgia's athletes won out. There were some big plays in that game that I remember. There was the punt return right before halftime that kind of cracked the door for Mississippi State. But I have to imagine both of those staffs this week, Stephen, are studying that game, how Georgia attacked the 3-3-5, how the 3-3-5 of Zach Arnett attacked Georgia. That's just something I think in the back of fans' minds to consider. Could be an advantage for Georgia that they've seen this unique defense and had success. Could be an advantage for TCU, knowing certain adjustments need to be made, but that just kind of came to my mind as we got this matchup finalized. Do you think that helps Georgia or hurts them?
I think it helps them. Now, if you ask Kirby Smart this week, he kind of downplayed it. Maybe he's just being coy, or maybe he's not showing his full hand. But it is such a unique scheme. You don't see this kind of 3-3-5 like all over the country. Like Gillespie, who runs it at TCU, was at Tulsa before, and this defense gave Josh Heupel, when he was at UCF, a lot of trouble. So it is a unique scheme, and they do a lot of things like the way that they're built. The linebackers are really good at like pursuing and tackling. They try to funnel a lot of that stuff. And then you look in the secondary, the two corners, Hodges, Tomlinson, and Newton, were pretty good. I mean, they gave up some plays against Michigan, but for the most part this year, that was a strength for TCU. So I think it helps to have some already data on the 3-3-5. And it may take Georgia a drive or two to settle in. But to me, you've already seen a similar offshoot of it. So just having that kind of knowledge and background, I think, can help Georgia here. Could also help, TCU watching the tape of Mississippi State and seeing maybe some things that they can do that Mississippi State wasn't able to do as well.
And I have no idea, Stephen, how similar Lincoln Riley and Garrett Riley's systems are. I would imagine they're fairly similar though. And I don't know how many matchups we've seen Lincoln Riley versus Kirby Smart. The only one that I can think of was that epic Rose Bowl. But and completely different teams, different players. I get it, but man, that was an all-time classic too. That I would imagine Lincoln's probably got some tips for old Garrett to attack in this Georgia defense. Of course, tips and actually executing it are two different things, but that could play somewhat of a factor in this matchup too, don't you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, I suspect that Garrett and Lincoln might be spending some time together on the phone. Or maybe Garrett's just going to stop over at the USC offices this week when he goes out there to prepare for the championship game. But no, I mean, I think you look at TCU and I think the danger of thinking about them is we've talked about Quentin Johnston, we've talked about Max Duggan, there are other receivers too. They're not this kind of finesse like passing team that's going to try and come out and throw it 50 times. I mean, they love to hit the big plays, but they got after Michigan in the trenches. They did a good job of getting push in the ground game on things like just short yardage. They also did a good job creating a couple big plays. They also use, I think, some timely tempo against Michigan too. They broke off a big run, and it was their backup that did it. I think that's one of the storylines too for Monday night is whether Kendre Miller plays for TCU. If he doesn't, DeMarcado, their backup, is solid, but he's not the same type of player. But when they were able to get one big play in the ground, they stayed in that same kind of package. And Michigan wasn't able to sub, so they caught them again in this kind of defensive formation they didn't want to be in, and was able to take advantage of it. So I think the danger of TCU is just thinking they're going to come out and throw it. No, they're going to try and come out and establish the line of scrimmage. They're going to try and run it. We'll see Max Duggan use his legs as well. But overall, I think the matchups in this game favor Georgia. TCU is going to need a lot to go right, including some big plays, including some tough yards on the ground to be able to keep this one within striking distance.
Sounds like TCU sure could use Zach Evans in his matchup. Oh, he's probably kicking himself.
Yeah, they really could. I mean, if you give TCU a healthy Kendre Miller and a Zach Evans, they're all of a sudden their odds look a little bit more favorable. But I think that's one of the things about TCU that from afar I think you could easily admire is that they've won differently. If they need the defensive stop, they got it. If they need to run the ball, they've been able to do it, and they can do the short pass to a big play with a catch and run. They can also hit the big plays downfield. So they can hurt you a lot of different ways if you're Georgia. And I think that's what makes that matchup fascinating is do they have one more time that they're a 13, 14-point underdog? Can they do it again against a Georgia team that I suspect we will get a much better effort all around after the game against Ohio State?